Thank you all for being here. This is, my name is Steve Ely. I'm going to be the discussion leader for this session, and I'm joined by a very distinguished panel of scholars and authors. And we didn't quite expect this setup, so I'm going to ask the panelists to, when they want to speak, to raise their hand and hold it up until I acknowledge. And Peter wants the entire morning session, but, and I'll acknowledge you, and I'll keep a list. So this is the 11th Carl B. Menges Colloquium. This is the third one I've had the opportunity to be discussion leader for. I think they're exciting, and one of the most exciting parts of this format is the audience out here. For my living, I work with Liberty Fund, and I run small group conferences like this one, except with no audience. So 15 people sitting in a room by themselves talking, and I like having the audience and the audience interaction in the second half. So we have three interesting sets of readings that we're going to be talking about over the next couple of days. Three chronological sets of readings that, if you go by Jefferson's accounting, two of them cover 2 generations. One of them covers about a generation and a half. And so we're going to be restarting each session with early materials. And so there may be a little bit of overlap in the way the conversation goes. And there are some items that are raised early on that I'm not going to ask questions about until later sessions, because we'll come back to them. But I would encourage the panelists not only to respond as they want to any questions that I have, but if they think there are important questions that haven't been put on the table, they should feel free to add those themselves. The first hour and 15 minutes of this session will be devoted to a panel discussion, and then the last half hour will be devoted to your questions and comments, the audience questions and comments. For the panelists, if you didn't get instructions on the microphone in front of you, there's a little face. If you press the face, the red light will come on. That means your microphone is live. When you're through speaking, touch the face again and the microphone will go off, so we don't have all the microphones on at one time. So there are, so let's get started. This first session is on, entitled History, Past and Future. And so one large question that I think is worth asking, and we may address it directly or indirectly, is what did Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton think we could learn from history? Did they think we could learn the same things? Did they think we learned different things? And then some specifics. 2 of our documents are pre-Declaration of Independence, and I thought we'd start with those. In the Summary View of the Rights of British America, written in July of 1774, Jefferson offers a catalog of the united complaints of His Majesty's subjects in America, and an outline of the rights which God and laws have given equally and independently to all. So, what were the major complaints, according to Jefferson, that the colonists had? And what were the major rights that Jefferson asserted? And one document that's not included here, but I think it's intended for us to reflect on, is the Declaration itself. What's the relationship of the Summary View to the Declaration? Has Jefferson modified his thought at all in the Declaration? There's one specific right I want to highlight, and that's what today we would call the right to exit. Jefferson says America was conquered and her settlements made and firmly established at the expense of individuals, not the British public. For themselves they fought, for themselves they conquered, and for themselves alone they have the right to hold. I wonder if this is good history. I wonder if it's good political philosophy. And then the second document is a letter from Thomas Jefferson to John Randolph in August of 1775. Jefferson says that his first wish is the restoration of our just rights, and he is looking with fondness toward reconciliation with Great Britain. What happened between August of 1775 and July of 1776? Was Jefferson alone in this hope? Was he in tune with the rest of his country? Was there a dramatic change of attitude on the part either of Great Britain or the colonists in this last year? So with that, the floor is open. Raise your hand and I'll start the queue.
You asked a lot of things.
Brad.
Yes, just on the question of Jefferson's use of history, it's very creative, I think. I don't think it's accurate. So I think he's using history to assert what are really philosophical principles. The two examples I can think of as his creative use of history, one is something that was kind of a trope of its time, I suppose, and that's his reference to the ancient Saxon constitution, that there used to be this golden age of liberty in England, and then those horrible Normans came along and destroyed it, and we've been clawing our liberties back ever since. You'll find the same thing, I know, from recent reading in Blackstone's commentaries, but I don't see how that we actually know what the ancient Saxon constitution was. So there's that. And the other element is his notion that individuals came from England and colonized America and chose to subject themselves to the common sovereign of the UK. That just seems to be very inventive to me. They had charters and so forth that they brought with them and set up governments under the tutelage of the king from the very beginning. So.
Okay, thanks, Brad. Carson Holloway.
You asked at the, sorry. Can you hear me now? Good. You asked at the beginning, what did Jefferson and Hamilton think we could learn from history? And I was struck in rereading this material how powerfully Hamilton seems to believe that war is an ineradicable part of human life and that you learn that from history. He makes that point in, I think, Federalist 6 among the readings that we read. I mean, I think sometimes in Jefferson you find a certain hopefulness about progress. I don't see that as much in Hamilton, especially in those passages where he makes a point of responding to kind of the argument that you hear from or heard from Montesquieu that commercial nations won't be as disposed to war. There'll be softening of mores and things like this. And Hamilton is aware of that, and I think he agrees with it to some extent, but he ends up by saying, well, commercial nations seem to go to war as much as anybody else. They just have new reasons to go to war. So there's a certain sobriety or pessimism about the human condition in Hamilton that I think he believes he's learning from history, and also thinks that he's got a kind of a political psychology or an account of the political passions that he's learned from history, where he says there that part of the reason war is ineradicable is because nations often act not in their own interest. I guess the basis for hope that we could do better would be that nations will act in their own interest. It's not in anybody's interest to go to war, but he kind of says there in the Federalist that oftentimes pride, desire for preeminence, and things like this overwhelm nations' sense even of their own interests. Even of their own interests. That's what makes war unavoidable.
Annette and then Peter.
Well, and to the question of whether or not this was good history, it's well, as discussed before, sort of a mythological understanding of history. It's also very legalistic. Jefferson is a lawyer making the best case that he can, and this version of history is one that separates out benefits from burdens, separates out responsibilities and duties. They came over as individuals, but they certainly thought that they would have the protection of the mother country if should anything happen. And the notion that they came over and just making a way for themselves doesn't seem accurate. But that's the best argument that he could make at this point, because that would be the British understanding of what the situation was, and that's how they would come out. I see him as meeting an argument that he knows would be made from the other side of the Atlantic. On the uses of history, Jefferson thought history was important, but there's, keeping with what I said before, a sort of instrumental view of it as well. And you can see that not so much in the documents here, but in his talk, well, we mentioned last night, talking about the uses of history for people today, at the present time. So there's a combination of a sense that the past matters and presenting a particular version of the past matters, and a skillful lawyer who's making the best case that he can using history as a tool.
Okay. Peter, then Joanne, and then Michael Zuckert.
Right. Well, of course it's lousy history, but I don't think that's the point, and that's what Annette is getting at. It's instead a new way of thinking about history. What's the whole project? And I think what's crucial for Jefferson is he's thinking about an emerging people, and that's what the Declaration will be about, a proclamation of nationhood. And he's situating that emerging people in a spatial and a temporal context, and those are closely connected. The geography of empire is the frame within which Jefferson thinks, and the transit of empires across time. He's moving away from a classical circular notion of history of rise and fall, and which is the history of all classical republics, and thinking now in linear terms, and linear both across space and through time. And this is what's remarkable, because I think what Jefferson is beginning to articulate is a conception of what we will call national history, which is foundational to the way we've understood history in the modern world. That is the history of peoples through time. It's from that perspective that sovereigns and regimes are relatively unimportant, because of course the whole point of kings is, as he says in the summary view, that they are the servants of the people. This, of course, is a wonderful way of reversing the idea of the king as the sovereign. Instead, the king merely justifies himself in instrumental terms as serving the interests of the people. So we're on the threshold of a new conception of a people in a place that is what will be emerging as the modal form in modern history, the nation state. So whether or not he gets the facts right is not important, because every nation state depends on an invented mythic notion of its past. In fact, that's what historians of nationalism have discovered and confirmed over the last couple of generations, is the inventiveness of historians who create a usable past to justify a particular nation and the claims that it makes for recognition in the larger world. And the last thing I'd say in this respect is that what ties many Hamilton and Jefferson together is a sense of the framework of empire and union. And Jefferson in the Randolph, letter to Randolph, talks about the British Empire as the greatest empire on earth. And that's a British Empire that is expanding across the North American continent. This notion of the universality of empire and the imminence of British control of the world, or at least the continent, is foundational to the Patriot Project. And that's the same project that, in his own very peculiar an absolutely inadequate way. I'm joking. Hamilton fits into the story as well. We can't begin to understand these guys if we don't think of them as imperialists. Empire is the frame. Time takes on new meaning within that framework. And we're now talking about the imminent emergence of a nation with a claim to a space that could have been part of the British Empire. It would have made it certainly the greatest empire on earth. But of course, what providential thinkers in the United States begin to think and claim is that we don't need that little island, as Thomas Paine said. The continent has a future itself. So space and time are the crucial determinants here.
Thanks, Peter. Joanne, Michael Zuckert, and John Rogasta.
I want to seize on a word that came up a couple times, and actually even in the question, which is the word accuracy. Although I like lousy, it's very tempting.
That's a technical term.
I know, I like that word.
Historians use it
I want to
often.
use lousy. But yes, I want to seize on the idea of accuracy, because I think
You didn't.
go off again?
Stop being so diminutive.
You turned it off. There you go. Okay, now can everybody hear me? Excellent. Okay.
It was good. You missed some good stuff.
I want to seize on the word accuracy, because I think, as others have suggested, there are different ways of thinking about history and different ways of thinking about the past. There's one that is linear and is date-centric, and there's another that the word duties has come up. There's another that's more about the spirit of the past and what the spirit of the past teaches. And I think in that sense, Hamilton and Jefferson are thinking along similar lines in the readings in this session. I think, Jefferson very much, particularly in the two documents that were highlighted for the beginning of our session here, he's thinking of the spirit of the past as a way of learning or confirming rights. And as Annette said, building a case for those rights being inherent in this society. Hamilton is using history in the same way, but for him, history is proving the true nature of human nature. So the spirit of the past teaches the sort of much less optimistic way that he has of looking at things. You look at the past and you see that people act for their own selfish interests and selfish desires, and that spirit should inform us in the present, would be the argument that he's making here.
Mike.
There I am. Yeah, I just want to say I think I'm in agreement with everybody. Not on? Oh, there it is. Said it was on. Okay, it is on now. Okay, I just wanted to agree in principle with, or start anyway there, with those who have spoken so far on the question of whether what Jefferson is giving us is good history or not, accurate or spiritual, whichever we may look at it as. It seems to me that what Jefferson is giving us is history guided by theory, or guided by his sense of the spirit of his time or of all times, and that in so doing, I don't think, by the way, that everything he says in this history is without some historical accuracy or with some historical merit, but we'll pass over that kind of question. But it seems to me that this question then leads to another question that Steve asked earlier, which is, how does the Declaration of Independence relate to Jefferson's longer statement in the Summary View of the Rights of British America? And I just want to say a little bit about that. One question that sometimes arises as people think about those two texts is whether they're actually compatible with each other, whether they have the same view about what they're saying about the relations between America and Britain. And I would like to put forward the thesis that they actually are very compatible with each other, but the two texts have quite different purposes. The purpose of the Summary View is to lay out, ultimately, Jefferson's picture of the constitutional relation between the colonies and Britain. That is to say, what authority the British have over the Americans, and analogously, what duties the Americans owe to the British. And he comes up with a fairly, what turns out to be pretty much the mature American view about that constitutional relation, in which Parliament is denied any authority over the Americans, and the connection between America and Britain is held to be largely through the king. But So his main point in that text is a constitutional point, and the main purpose of the text, it seems, goes along with something that Brad said earlier at the very beginning of the discussion, I believe, which is that the one text aims, or no, I guess it was Steve, sorry. The one text aims at a sort of reconciliation. That is, it aims to lay out the terms on which America and Britain may restore a good and healthy relationship on terms acceptable to the Americans. Turned out these are not the same terms acceptable to the British. And so its purpose is restorative so far as that's possible on the kind of terms the Americans have come to. The other document, the Declaration of Independence, is announcing a break, of course. That is, it's defending a revolution, and it's defending a revolution on principles of political legitimacy. That is, philosophical principles, whereas the summary view appealed partly to philosophical principles and partly to history, as we've been discussing. But I would argue, as I said at the beginning of my comments, that the summary view of the history presented there is history already guided by a theory, and the theory that's guiding it is, I believe, pretty much or exactly the same as the theory that finds expression in the Declaration in a document with, as I said, a different purpose, but which tries to express the same, to use Joanne's term, the same spirit, so to speak, about what government's all about. Thanks.
I'm not going to join the question of accuracy. I mean, I agree with Michael that Jefferson uses history in an instrumental fashion here. He does that continuously. I want to shift things a little bit to an earlier question Steve asked. He said, is it good history? Is it good policy? And right before you had laid that out, you say one of the points in summary views is the right to exit. That Jefferson expresses that every person has the right to withdraw themselves from the political community in which they exist. Well, the flip side of the right to exit is the right to enter, or if not the right to enter, the right to choose. That, and I thought Peter was going to get into this. I'll transmit Peter here for a little bit. We choose to be a people. I mean, the fundamental point for Jefferson, both in summary view and in the Declaration, is you choose to form a political entity. The one-person language, when one people decides that it is time to form a union. So the central issue in summary view is not history. It's this idea that a political entity only exists when the Republican political entity, small r Republican, only exists when the people choose to do so. And this obviously has implications that continues to be an issue because European sovereigns say, no, you're born a subject, you're always a subject. Continues to be an issue through the War of 1812, continues obviously to be very much an issue today. Americans are not Americans because they're born in a particular place or they're a particular ethnicity or a particular religion. That's how Europeans saw a people. No, you're a people because you choose to be part of this republic.
Annette, and then Carson.
I was just thinking more about this issue of tying the two documents together and looking at them together. What I see is a sense of loss, potential loss or actual loss, on the question of whether or not people came over to be separate from the others. It's pretty clear, as Peter was saying, that this was an enterprise of empire. And the idea, and he says it in the Declaration, that we could have been a great people. We could have done these things together. And there's a sense of betrayal on the part of the king. And Jefferson is responding to all of that. So both of these documents, to me, go to this question of loss, that this is something that we could have done and we're not going to do it. On this question of history, and Joanne's point about Hamilton seeing history, giving us a much more, perhaps malign view, or more realistic, however you want to see it, view of human nature. Jefferson is writing these things as a person conceiving of himself as a person of the Enlightenment, a person who thought that there would be progress in the world and that there could be new types of people. As people learn, become educated, become enlightened, things could change. So this view of history is important, but also this notion of the possibility of progress, the possibility of science. Jefferson is a person who thinks of the world in terms of science. Just as you get new discoveries, new ways of doing things, there can be new ways of thinking. So we wouldn't be tied to the old ways. History is not a straitjacket. It's something that gives us something we could look at and make decisions or see what people did in the past, but we're not necessarily bound to those views. So in the background, he's not talking in terms of enlightenment specifically here, but that's what he's doing. You think of his other writings, his other actions. He's the person who thinks that there will be a new type of person as the world becomes much more enlightened and things can change.
Carson, then Peter, and then Joanne.
Okay, thank you. I wanted to go back to something you'd said at the beginning when you asked about what happened between the summary view and the Declaration of Independence. Of course, part of the answer is they were fighting, right? And they got fed up and thought they can't live with these people any longer. And I thought that was pretty interesting because it reminds us that history in the sense of the actual facts as they're developing can change people's sense of the principles for which they're contending. We can think about the Revolution as American commitment to a set of principles for which they then fought and prevailed. But Jefferson especially reminds us in one of these passages that I really liked that the actual fighting itself can change your sense of what the principles are. And I'm thinking of this letter to John Randolph of August 25th, 1775, and he's giving his account of what he thought Congress intended in 1774 and the conditions they laid out for reconciliation with Britain. And he has a passage where he says this, I'll read it. The Congress stated the lowest terms they thought possible to be accepted in order to convince the world they were not unreasonable. They gave up the monopoly and regulation of trade and all the acts of Parliament prior to 1764, leaving to British generosity to render these at some future time as easy to America as the interest of Britain would admit. But this was before blood was spilt. I cannot affirm, and I have reason to think, these terms would not now be accepted. That's kind of a good, realistic reminder of what I think the political theorist Hans Morgenthau called escalation, right? The war aims can escalate because, and this goes back to what I was saying earlier about Hamilton, the pride of the nation is invested in this now. What I asked for before is not enough any longer because you disputed with us. That was one thing I wanted to observe. And then just a separate point, but it relates to this discussion we've had about the right to exit. I just offer it as my own view because people raised the question whether Jefferson is good political theory. He said something that I thought was a little bit problematic in the summary view when he talked about being the country of your birth is the place that chance, not choice, placed you. And the reason I find that a problem is because in many other contexts he does invoke the idea of providence, that there's a divine being supervising the development of history. We can appeal to that providence as a source of justice. It's kind of jarring to me when in another context he suggests that the place of your native birth is not a providential fact. It's just a matter of chance. And pushed on that enough, it might unravel a lot of things. I mean, if the place of your birth is merely a matter of chance, it may be that your existence is merely a matter of chance. And then it might look like the universe is unintelligible, and a lot of things could go south on that view. I'm not insisting on that, but it's something that came to mind.
Peter, and then Joanne.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And what I'd like to emphasize is that Americans then as now wanted to have it both ways. They wanted to be British or English, and then they wanted the benefits of independence. And history is crucial to this project of first being part of another people and then becoming a new people. How did that happen? And what we have with Jefferson is a sense both of the continuities of history, a conventional way we think about it. It's the history of settlements in North America and the expansion of those settlements by farmers, as he calls them, laborers in the version of the summary view that we have here, or farmers, those people who are cultivators of the land, and we might importantly add property owners. And really, this is a mobilization of property owners because conceptions of rights are deeply grounded, and I use that word advisedly, in the common law and property ownership. We get to natural rights, and I know Michael is probably going to throttle me later. I really love natural rights. Some of my best friends are natural rights. But this, we'll talk later. So there is a very, very deeply English sense of where rights come from, and that's articulated. So continuity is important, but then we have the discontinuity of a group of disconnected provinces in the British Empire suddenly recognizing that they are a people. This is a complicated transaction, and choice is important. Choice is actually only available to you, to pick up on Carson's theme, at certain moments that you might consider providential, when a people, or a people who didn't know they were a people, become conscious of themselves as a people. And it's within the context or framework of a debate over rights and the character of the imperial constitution that disconnected peoples who saw themselves as subjects of King George III under the rule of distinct provincial governments then suddenly imagined themselves to be something more. What's critical is that time doesn't begin in July 4th, 1776. There isn't a new calendar. It's continuous. It has to be continuous because in many ways, of course, as we've long known, the American Revolution is profoundly conservative. It wants to preserve rights, preserve the property, preserve the achievement of these generations of farmers who didn't know they were becoming an independent people. So history has to function in a variety of ways. And that's, I think, the genius of the revolutionary generation is to convince people at this moment that they do have a choice and that they could become a people. But of course, what we're not talking about is all those people who didn't become people, part of the people, that is loyalists, or the fellow travelers and sunshine patriots that Paine talks about. So I think that keeping in mind the continuity and discontinuity at this particular moment, that in many ways the shadow of empire, the implicit framework of empire, survives well past independence. These are still colonizing British people all over the world. English and British people, particularly British, is important once we include Scotland and Ireland in this larger project of one of the episodes of globalization. The United States is the only one of these settler colonized areas that becomes an independent nation, and that's an important thing to keep in mind. It underscores, I think, the contingency of American independence and nationhood. It's not something that anybody had intended. A few hotheads might have thought about it early in the imperial crisis, but it was a radical fringe thought. The whole point of Patriot mobilization was to renegotiate and solidify, make into a kind of a big constitution or a treaty with the British, the terms of empire. And so history is important at this moment when the key thing about the revolution is to convince the people that it's their project. We have the fiction of the people, that invented idea that we are a people. Then we have the reality of getting bodies on the line to make war. And I think this, just to suggest what we will be talking about, is where we come up with distinctive, important differences between our two characters. What role exactly do the people, real people, play in the history of this new nation?
Joanne.
I suppose I want to pick up on both what Annette and Peter just said, because it's striking the degree to which, for Jefferson, history is about demonstrating choice and change and progressivism, that history is sort of demonstrating and highlighting all of that, whereas really, for Hamilton, history is a way to understand danger. History is something that demonstrates threats. Interestingly, the only sort of threat language that's explicitly in these first two documents is in summary view. Jefferson writes, "Let not the name of George III be a blot in the page of history." So history is a threat there, right? If you misbehave, if you act badly now, then history will remember you. We know about history. But it's striking how the sort of fundamental essence of the thinking process of both of these men is really captured in the way that they're looking at the past. And I think particularly as well, I think the formal title of this section was History, Past, and Future, I think. And that point in and of itself makes that bond really clear, right? That what you think of the past is explicitly an expression of what you think the future can do.
Colleen.
Well, I like Peter's question, though probably not his answer. No. Just kidding, Peter. About what role do the people play in this new order of the ages? And these readings here, as early as they are, really show the basis of the difference, don't they, in the temperaments between Jefferson and Hamilton. And that it's not just a question of temperament, though, as important as that is. It's a question of principle, and that's really pointed out to us in these readings by their different views on France. You know, remember Hamilton will say of Jefferson and Madison that they have a womanish attachment to France, and that Jefferson has just drunk too deeply from the well of French philosophy. And you can see that coming through in this, and there's a certain sense in which Jefferson did drink very deeply from the well of French philosophy, including his agreements to some extent with Condorcet, and that whole notion of progress that Condorcet is so totally wedded to really has an influence on Jefferson. I don't think Jefferson in the end goes as far as Condorcet, because here's where it becomes critical. Condorcet's theory of progress is ultimately a theory that nature changes through history, and that both the human mind and morality can change to such an extent that nature itself is different. I don't think in the end Jefferson goes there, and because if he did, it would mean that his natural rights philosophy couldn't hold up. And so I think the fundamental agreement that we have between the two, despite very serious disagreements about politics, principles, and questions of stability, is that they are both firm believers and hold on to those ideas throughout their entire lives of the idea of natural law and natural rights. We don't have the Farmer Refuted essay in here, but that's one in which Hamilton is crystal clear about his commitment to the idea of natural rights, contrary to the Hobbesian notion of that.
The first couple of documents we have from Hamilton deal with, lost my place. The Continentalist from August of 1781, he hits a theme that seems to occur frequently in his writings, and that is that the system the whole system is in disorder. We need immediate correction, and I will just for that I will leave it. What's the cause of the disorder that he sees, that Hamilton sees, and what's his solution? And that leads us to Federalist number 1, it seems to me, where he suggests that the United States has, for the first time in world history, a chance to establish a government on the basis of reflection and choice and not on accident and force. And I wonder if that's what happened. The floor is open.
Hi. Well, I wonder if we can put those two Hamilton readings in conversation with some of the threads we talked about earlier in terms of this question of, you know, is Jefferson the optimist versus Hamilton the pessimist? And I think it's not hard to see this strand of pessimism in Hamilton's thought, and indeed in these documents in his fear of disorder. And Hamilton, I think, growing up a penniless orphan, could be forgiven for having a pronounced pessimism. But I also wonder if there's another way where we could think of Hamilton as an optimist. And if you look in Federalist 1, where he talks about the government, a vigorous government is the protector of liberty, there's an optimism there about the potential of a centralized government that you don't see from a Jefferson. And for Jefferson, he had this fear that centralized power would necessarily encroach on liberty. And I think it's not so much a question of whether Hamilton just wanted a different balance between these two things. If you see a central government as a protector of liberty, and you're optimistic about that, then you have a lot less to fear from the kind of system of government he's arguing for in the Federalist Papers.
In Federalist number 6, somebody, I forget who, but somebody already noted that Hamilton offers an attack. Oh, I should be on. Can you hear me? Okay. In Federalist number 6, Hamilton offers a critique of one of the standard tropes of liberal political philosophy, that commercial nations are pacific in their relations with each other, and he offers something that recurs later in his discussion of the French Revolution, what he calls visionary or designing men who stand ready to advocate the paradox of perpetual peace between the spirit of commerce and between the states, though dismembered and alienated from each other, and a general critique of what he calls projectors, that is, ideologues who have a bright vision that is not based on any definite understanding of individuals, human nature, or history. In his views on the French Revolution, he talks about projectors also. I'm wondering if, in Hamilton's mind, Jefferson qualified as a projector. Peter.
Yeah, well, it is a project. It is a project of moving with the enlightened times. And for Jefferson, it's self-evident, to coin a phrase, that things will unfold progressively once the old regime is shattered and destroyed. What I think is crucial here, Colleen rightly brings France into the picture. Let's bring Britain into the picture as well. If you look at Federalist 6, his definitive refutation of the argument of the sweet commerce, peaceful character, the golden dream, or the dream of a golden age, is the fact that Britain is the closest you come in the modern world to in fact, it's definitional of commercial republic. Adam Smith writes The Wealth of Nations, and that in a way marks the leading world historical role of Britain in defining the terms of political economy, yet Britain has been constantly at war. Jefferson grows up and is early educated as an Anglophile. He loves England, loves it to death, you might say, metaphorically speaking, because that Anglophilia becomes Anglophobia. And what seems paranoid and excessive in Jefferson throughout his later career is his preemptive hatred of Britain, as if it epitomizes the absolute worst of the old regime, when he knows it doesn't, because he's been in France. And he admits this at various points. Britain does have constitutional government. There is rule of law. Commerce is important. Yet this hatred of Britain carries over to an explanation for why it is that American provincials have been involved in war up until this point, because all the European wars played out in the American theater. They wouldn't have happened if it weren't for the imperial rivalries of Britain and its enemies. And of course, that's what's going to change in the political economy of the world, as the Americans will show the way of a regime that does not have dynastic ambitions, that is not struggling for domination and the balance of power, to hold the balance, as the British like to think they did in the 18th century. Instead, America would be exempt from this, not only because of its isolation or distance from the old world, but because of the character of its regime. Jefferson has to exaggerate the differences between the old British imperial regime and the new American system. Whereas Hamilton says essentially, basically, we're working with administration, with the capacity of government, with the ability to hold your own in these inevitable ongoing conflicts that mark the history of the modern world. So if you're going to declare independence, that means you're declaring that you're going to achieve the capacity to hold your own among the powers of the earth. Whereas Jefferson thinks that this could be a pivotal moment in world history, showing the way for the entire European system to transform the world. And I think that's supposed to be the point of the American Revolution. It's not for Americans alone, it's for mankind. Yet for Jefferson to think these things, his attitudes towards Britain are absolutely crucial, because what the revolution is all about, the choices that people make are, do they want to turn against people they once thought of as their cousins or part of a great British family, imperial family, and make war against them? So it's an irony that the man of peace, who imagines an end to war, is willing to unleash the dogs of war among people who thought they did constitute a great imperial nation, that is the British. So these paradoxes of war and peace will play out throughout.
Carson and Joanne and Annette.
Just a real quick thought before I say, the other thing I want to say is Peter's remark reminds me that somewhere in Aristotle's Politics, he says, where there's the most love, there's the most hate. You know, because you thought you were going to be treated better by your own people. It's interesting that on this question of the American Revolution being of world historical significance, I wonder if, and I want the Jeffersonians to correct me if I'm wrong, but I wonder if Jefferson believed that more than Hamilton did, because one thing that was pointed out to me by a friend of mine in the profession is, you read that first paragraph of Federalist 1, Hamilton's actually a little bit more reserved than you think if you just sort of remember it, because he does say, it has been frequently remarked that it seems to have been reserved to the American people. It's sort of an idea that he's invoking for his purposes, but he doesn't really fully commit himself to it. And so he leaves open the possibility that we could succeed, and maybe it won't work anywhere else, or maybe we'll fail, and maybe it'll work somewhere else anyway. Also on this question of progress, I guess I wanted to say that from a certain standpoint, we've talked about Hamilton's sort of sober or pessimistic view of human nature. It'd be conventional to think of Hamilton as a kind of conservative, but as Colleen was implicitly reminding us, almost all Americans are liberals of a certain kind. Small L liberal, they believe in natural rights. They believe in certain kind of individualism. So on this question of progress, it seems to me that, I mean, Hamilton does believe in a certain amount of progress. Think about Federalist 9, isn't it, that he talks about improvements in the science of politics that have made it possible to arrange Republican government in a more satisfactory way. So I think he wants to be on that train a little bit, and I also noticed that too in this nice excerpt on his view of the French Revolution, where there's a certain paragraph you can read, and I read it and thought, yeah, Hamilton views himself as sort of a moderate Enlightenment man. Here, I'll just read this real quick and then I'll be done, but he says, this is what has happened. Wise and good men took a lead in delineating the odious character of despotism, in exhibiting the advantages of a moderate and well-balanced government, in inviting nations to contend for the enjoyment of rational liberty. Then, fanatics in political science have since exaggerated and perverted their doctrines, right? So there's a big difference between them and where they think this thing is heading, I think. You can see it in that passage.
Joanne and then Annette.
I want to combine, actually, some of the ideas in these last comments. I mean, the question of would Hamilton think of Jefferson as a projector of sorts? I think, as others have said, I think the answer is yes, because I think projecting in that way is not unrelated, certainly in Hamilton's mind, to sort of seducing the populace. I mean, I think if you look at Federalist number 1, where he says, of those men who have overturned the liberties of republics. The greatest number have begun their career by paying an obsequious court to the people, commencing demagogues and ending tyrants. And that's a real Hamiltonian formulation, that people who offer those sorts of sweet nothings to people are dangerous because people follow in that direction, and then inevitably, because of his view of human nature, things go wrong. But I also want to come back to the point about Hamilton maybe being optimistic in a different sort of way, which I think he is. I think he's optimistic about structures of government and processes of government. And so I think when you talk about the improvement in the science of politics, I think that's part of the same logic, is that he's not necessarily thinking fully, I guess, and I'm hedging, because I think in Federalist One, on the one hand, he's saying the process that we're initiating here and the way in which we're doing it is seemingly unprecedented, or certainly something novel that is important, that the process operates the way that it might be able to. Who knows if it'll succeed, but it might, and if it does, that's actually showing something. So I think his optimism is not in human nature, but it's in the power of structures of government and processes of government to channel human nature in ways for the better.
And I would join in with the notion that he would consider Hamilton would consider Jefferson a projector and a visionary. This notion of being a visionary in a way that's not that great. Jefferson thought not only was there sort of optimism here, but that America, that the United States of America, and he says it in a letter, famous letter, that we can say there is something new under the sun. He was an American exceptionalist. He believed that America was exceptional and that it was supposed to be a beacon for the world. And if you think that, you must have an idea that history, as Peter was suggesting before, that things can change. History tells us some things, but it doesn't tell us everything, as we can, with progress, become different people. On this question of human nature and understandings about progress, I find it really interesting that to think of it in those terms, that the process, that you can be optimistic about structures and process. But I think Jefferson would say that structures and process are run by people. And you have to understand, you have to have a particular understanding of how people will do that, that's how it counts. Who is the person who sets up the process? How does the structure work? So there are differing approaches to it. I don't think that anybody who's involved in a revolution and who can think about things the way Hamilton thought about things couldn't have an idea, a certain kind of idea of progress. I think this is a matter of a continuum, who's on the continuum. And Jefferson tended much more towards the visionary side, and Hamilton may have been more conservative in that particular area. But this notion that there was something new under the sun, that the United States was something important and that was exceptional, is clearly a part of Jefferson's thinking in all of this. He has a real plan about this from the very, very beginning. He's thinking about what could happen in the country and what would happen, particularly with him at the helm.
Before we go back to the queue, I want to put a couple of other items on the table. We have two readings dealing with the Louisiana Purchase. And when I looked at those, I said, well, because both Hamilton and Jefferson offer their prognosis of what that's going to mean to the nation. So my question would be, who is the better future historian, looking ahead, projecting ahead, Hamilton or Jefferson? And then I wanted to touch on the nature of constitutions. A late letter from Jefferson to Samuel Kercheval from 1816. Jefferson looks askance at those people who look at constitutions with sanctimonious reverence. And he talks about, this is where he has a discussion of generations, the need for each generation to be able to rework their primary document, and what are the implications of that. What's that do to the status of the Constitution, and how does that compare with with Hamilton's view on the Constitution. So we have a fairly lengthy queue. Let me read all the names I've got down now. Michael Zuckert, Brad, Doug, Carson, John, and Peter. So, Michael.
I'm going to mostly address, I think, the earlier questions on the table rather than the new ones, which are certainly interesting. I would say to your question of who proved to be a better prognosticator about the Louisiana Territory, I guess the answer has to be Jefferson on that one. But to return to the other question, which had to do with the prognosticator issue, and I would start by disagreeing with what everybody said. Yes, Hamilton considered Jefferson one of those prognosticators, and indeed, he seemed to think he was one of the worst of them. So the answer there seems to me pretty clear. But what I would like to introduce that's a little different from what most people have emphasized so far is 2 points. First, that we need to be more historical ourselves, I think, about the way in which we're looking at them, and especially at the way we're looking at them on the question of history, because it seems to me that they don't stand towards each other in the same way throughout their careers, that there are changes that occur, and that it's worth paying attention to when and why those occur. Secondly, I would add that I think Hamilton is also a prognosticator. That is, he may not be as radical or violent a prognosticator as Jefferson, or a planner, one of these projectors, I should say. But as a projector, he is one also. So let me mention a few of the aspects of Hamilton's thinking and the way in which he and Jefferson were quite close at certain points in their careers that make me include him among the group of projectors. The first thing I think I would mention is to refer to Federalist number 9, which I think Carson referred to a little bit earlier. In Federalist number 9, for those of you who don't have it exactly in your heads, it's a place where Hamilton says, the fate of Republican government looks very risky because the history of republics has been not very successful. And he goes through a lot of stuff about disorder and et cetera that come out in historical republics. But he says, well, we've experienced great progress in the science of politics since those experiments, and we now are possessed of tools that promise much greater success for republicanism, and that we're applying those new tools in this new Constitution. So there's a case where Hamilton is putting some of his money out there on a project based on theoretical and to some degree practical advances. But the theoretical advances, in a way in the American context, outstrip the practical because the American system, while building on some of those things that, let's say, the philosopher Montesquieu discovered about Britain, nonetheless goes well beyond what the British example or the Montesquieuian model had actually provided for. So there's one case where I think Hamilton is rather progressive, rather hopeful, and rather projector-like. A second point that came up in the discussion on this is that I think Peter mentioned this, that Jefferson was inclined to see the advances that America was making as not only important for America, but as important for all of mankind. And the fact is, Hamilton also was inclined to see things that way. Federalist number 1, for example, is a place where he does talk about, he addresses, I love this part of Federalist 1, where he directly addresses, in the first sentence of the Federalist Papers, he addresses the American people as you. You have it in your hands to do this thing, which is going to be great not only for us, but eventually for all mankind. And that's, again, that's the way a projector talks, not the way a arch conservative talks. So I'm going to leave it at that. I've already gone on long enough. But it seems to me it's a more complicated story, and that we need to maybe put more effort into trying to find what's the moment at which they start to diverge from each other. Because it's clear by the time we come to the end, they have diverged a great deal.
Brad, then Doug.
Yeah, so I wanted to address one instance of of a diversion between the two of them. But first, I mean, following on something Colleen said, it's very clear that Hamilton embraced the doctrine and the commitment to natural rights. He does that in The Farmer Refuted, and a follow-up essay written to refute a loyalist named Samuel Seabury. But what's interesting in contrast to Jefferson is that Hamilton goes through the history of each of the colonies and how they were established, under what legal terms with Great Britain. He eschews the tact that Jefferson takes of just simply saying, well, they were individuals who decided to associate themselves to the king. He wants to give a legal argument, not one of free choice. Then we see Jefferson arguing in the summary view for a natural right of emigration, to leave one country and attach to another, an individual right. And there we find them disagreeing with one another. I know it's bad form to refer to a reading from another section, but the letter to Phocion that Hamilton writes, having to do with the treatment of loyalists after the Revolution by the state of New York. Hamilton says that it's wrong to think that a person can, at his own pleasure, leave the country of which he's a citizen and attach himself to a foreign jurisdiction. He says this principle is contrary to law and subversive of government. Now that's Peter mentioned the older European view, and that's it. It's still there with Hamilton. So what interests me about this is, I mean, there is this interesting question of whether it's right to think of emigration in Jefferson terms or in Hamiltonian terms, but it also suggests a way in which our understanding of natural rights or our commitment to natural rights evolves over time. I mean, I think it'd be very few of us now who would take the Hamiltonian position on this. I think it's almost in our DNA now that people can, leave the country in which they were born and attach themselves to another country, and that's all just fine and good as a matter of natural freedom. Yeah.
Doug and then Kevin.
Just want to pick up on a couple points that Carson made about Federalist One, and then Joanne about Hamilton's sort of optimism and how he isn't he's not a pessimist, but I think, even in Federalist One, I think Carson made a really good point. It's a really qualified notion that America has some exceptional role to play. I think he's much more humble about that, and he basically says, this is an experiment, we're going to try it. And even in Federalist One, he's already worried about despotism, as this sort of, what's he call it, this dangerous ambition, what sort of specious zeal for people's rights. He's really fearful that it can fall apart, and that's one of the reasons why I think he's so worried about people like Jefferson, who do sort of see America as this bold new thing. I think he really sees we're just creating another country, and in Federalist 6, when he says, we got to wake up from this deceitful dream about we're building something new, and we should say that we, as well as all the other inhabitants of the globe, are yet remote from that happy empire of a perfect wisdom and perfect virtue. So it's this very sort of, his notion of progress, I think, is what Joanne was getting at. It's this very qualified, incremental, maybe we can do it better, but this is not some bold new Novus Ordo. This is more, we're just going to assume a position here where maybe we can get it a little bit better. But and that the great danger to the experiment is exactly that kind of overzealous, utopian, the projectors, all that stuff that invites the demagogue who then becomes the tyrant. So I think, and when he says that history gives us uniform course of human events, that's why I think he's so qualified about his optimism. It's not that he doesn't have it, but it's one that he knows is an incredibly fragile thing. And I think he says that already in Federalist One. So from the get-go, he's tempering the optimism of what the experiment can and can't achieve, and warning about the dangers that would undo it and thus destroy even the modest incremental progress it might yield.
Kevin.
Jefferson's friend, James Madison, once told a correspondent of his that Jefferson's was a mind that conceived of things in the very boldest ways. And I think Jefferson liked to play with bold ideas. He liked to assert things in the most categorical frames, even when that wasn't necessary. So, for example, in earlier discussion of some review of the rights of British America, Annette said that Jefferson was making the best lawyer's argument by saying things that virtually everybody would have known were, in the end, false. And I would have to respond, well, was that really the best lawyer's argument? That is, could Jefferson not have said, we had charters, they're being violated. Historically in England, if your charters were being violated, if local rights or the rights of the commons were being violated, this was ground for violent resistance. You didn't have to make up some pseudo-historical argument. You could state your case in that way. That, I think, would be the way a lawyer would actually do this. And when Jefferson was himself an attorney, that's the way he generally framed things. But when he was talking about politics, for some reason, he would, I think, latch on to maybe a categorical case or a more extreme version or something that would be universally applicable. When he described the Declaration of Independence, he said this was my political creed, etc. He didn't need to do this. In the letter to Kercheval, he's considering Virginia's 1776 Constitution, with which he's been frustrated virtually from the moment he knew that it had been adopted. And one thing that was frustrating, entirely anti-Jeffersonian about the 1776 Virginia Constitution, was that it made no provision for amendment. It could not be amended. So if you didn't like anything about it, you had to pursue radical political remedies of some kind. So where does this lead Jefferson? Yes, he did from time to time tell people that he would favor having a new convention, say, but he also goes into this long explanation of why we need to throw out constitutions every 19 years. And I see, again, his friend Madison following, cleaning up after the parade. If he had read this letter to Kercheval, I'm sure that he would have whipped out his broom, right? This was not necessary. Jefferson could have argued for reform of the Virginia Constitution of 1776 on Madisonian grounds, on Hamilton's grounds. We should have an amendable constitution. There have been improvements in political science. Virtually every other state has a better state constitution than we have now. We could make changes, but no. He goes into this Frenchified thinking about what ought to be done with Virginia in response to the problems in Virginia's Constitution. And I think this attitude of Jefferson's, this intellectual attitude, is starkly anti-Hamiltonian, too. It's virtually the opposite of Hamilton's. Jefferson seems to think blank slates are a joy. And for Hamilton, the absence of rightly constituted authority is a potential disaster. So I find it's interesting that he phrases things this way, and people ask, well, how did he end up with 19 years, not 21? Whatever the answer is, it's a kind of a game. And if it were a public statement, it would be irresponsible. But he's egging on these Western Virginia people who want constitutional reform. In the end, it didn't work, and largely for the reason that the original Constitution wasn't amendable. But again, I think both of these, and there have been several others that have come to mind as we've been talking about these materials, both of these are examples of Jefferson's tendency to state things in the boldest way. That was Madison's very guarded personality criticism of his late friend. I think he was right about that.
We're about 4 minutes away from audience questions, so write it down so you don't forget it, and we'll go on to our next two panelists, Carson and then John.
I wanted to say one more thing about Hamilton's judgment of Jefferson as a projector, visionary, speculatist, and I may anticipate the later readings a little bit, but if Brad can do it, I can do it too. And I have, I guess, 2 points. One is it might help clarify it a little bit, and the other point is that it may be an interesting example of how to judge public figures. I'd say Hamilton clearly viewed Jefferson as a projector. He says that. That is a negative judgment on Jefferson in Hamilton's mind for the reasons people have said. But then I wanted to add there are 2 qualifications, of course. One is Hamilton thought Jefferson was a sincere projector. He differentiates him from the demagogue/tyrant who just wants to stir things up and get control and then rule. It's pretty clear, I think, that he regards Jefferson as a man of good moral character, but whose convictions are misguided. And then the other qualification is, as it comes out later too, is he says Jefferson is a sincere projector who is a man of cautious temperament. And that's another thing you can say in his favor, that he won't make any fast moves or sudden moves because he will be guided by his understanding of public opinion and what might become of his reputation and things like that. So, yeah, Jefferson's a projector, but he's not the worst kind of projector. And he's he's a preferable to the one that was also at issue in 1800.
John.
Ehrenberg, we weren't going to go there. This issue of optimism versus projection, I mean, Andrew, Joanne, Doug all say there's a different type of optimism in Hamilton than in Jefferson. Well, let's add some meat to that bone and talk about some specifics. Annette says Jefferson is visionary, and I think that's correct. He's a visionary optimist. Peter says, well, he's a pacifist because all the world's going to be like us and republics aren't going to have to fight. Well, how does that work out for you, Tom? It doesn't. And, you know, we get to the embargo, we get to the War of 1812 because it's not going to work. Hamilton recognizes that government is an optimistic tool, but put that in a specific historic context. And Michael's, I think, point goes to that in Federalist 9, he's talking about tools that can be used in a progressive manner, in a way that's going to be good for the country. When he's writing Federalist Number 1, and Madison is with him, let's keep in mind, Madison is not with Jefferson at the time, he's with Hamilton. And what they're talking about is the tyranny of the majority. Madison is very upset about what's going on in Virginia because the majority, and in places like Rhode Island and in places like Massachusetts, where the majority is pushing reform to favor debtors over creditors because that's interfering with the natural right of property. And so we have the tyranny of the majority. Madison is, people are aware of that. That's a common example that comes up. Madison's actually more upset about the tyranny of the majority on religion because this is right after the general assessment debate in Virginia. Actually, the general assessment debate goes on for a considerable period of time, where the idea is the majority of the people, being Christian, are going to say, well, we'll have a tax to support all Christian sects. And Madison says this is an outrage. This is a tyranny of the majority. So how do you stop that? Well, you stop that with a conservative constitution which creates governmental power. So the issue is not liberty versus government power, the dynamic that it had always been. Madison's recognizing, this is something Jack Rakove talks about, Madison is realizing that part of the problem is private power against private power, and government may be necessary as a positive force to control that. And that's exactly what I think Hamilton is talking about. He's a commercialist. He certainly wants a commercial empire, but he recognizes there's going to have to be power for that good, natural right, individually promoting commercial empire to exist. On the final, Steve, you asked about the sanctimonious reverence. You might have added metaphysical subtleties. Here's Thomas Jefferson, originalist, referring to the Constitution as metaphysical subtleties. I think the issue comes back again to choice. And the issue with generations is the problem is that previous generation shouldn't be allowed to choose for you. Now, that raises interesting questions about originalism in history, but we'll wait till this afternoon to get into that.
Thank you. We have 2 microphones set up. If you have a question, go to one of the microphones. Please introduce yourself and ask the question. Bob, are these microphones already on? Okay, just right here on my left. Go ahead.
Dr. Annette Gordon-Reed and Dr. Douglas Ambrose brought up the concept of American exceptionalism and the American experiment, and Professor Ambrose, who touched upon the fragility of the American experiment. And it seems that history rhymes, but new things can still arise from the old. But as Hamilton touches upon in views on the French Revolution, history can also have gross mutations pop up from the old. And so the American Constitution proved to be a living document of liberty instead of a parchment guarantee. And the American Revolution proved to be successful beyond mere initial triumph. So what allowed the Constitution to establish a sustainable foundation for a Republican and free government compared to one of lies and disguised tyranny? And who between Hamilton and Jefferson do you believe gave the greatest contribution for the success of the American experiment?
Okay.
Yeah.
I don't know where to start. I mean, that's where we're here for the weekend to talk about, I guess. Gosh. Well, first, I'm not so sure it was so successful. A little civil war there, you know, a million dead, trying to decide what exactly this thing was that we were making, right? So, and again, I think that's baked in from the beginning. So I think and I think, boy, I'm not quite sure. Anybody want to help me? Turn on the red lights. Go ahead.
I mean, one thing they talk about, for Constitution Day, I did something in high school years ago, and I brought the students in excerpts from the Russian Constitution, from the Chinese Constitution, from the US Constitution. And of course, these were younger students. They didn't know what they were. And I said, which one's better? And of course, the Russian Constitution's better because it has all these words in it, and it seems to guarantee you more rights. One of the reasons why the American Constitution has worked so well for 200 years is because it's so short. And they actually talk about this in the ratification debates. They recognize that we can't, and this is very Jeffersonian, we can't predict what's going to be going on 200 years from now. This is the point about sanctimonious reverence. So one of the reasons the American Constitution works is because we didn't try to answer every question.
Anyone else on this? Yes, sir.
Allegedly, Nixon said that the Constitution's short and everybody should read it, and that he read most of it.
Is this on? Yes, my name's Jim Thompson, and I'm delighted to hear the panelists talk on these subjects, and I wanted to throw a general question out about the summary view. And there's a tendency to expand it into universal discussions and whatnot. But I don't think that, does it really make sense? Jefferson was in a moment. Okay. Jefferson, the whole debate on rights and grievances had been going on. People have been trying to define colonial rights and grievances for years. And a famous example was put forward created by Samuel Adams in the town meeting in Boston in November of 1772, where he defines rights mainly in terms of Locke's concepts of natural right that he said belonged to individuals. But Jefferson, in this summary view, he had come, the House of Burgesses had recessed, he had gone home, they were debating what to do, and so he prepares this document, and I brought my Merrill Peterson anthology, so because it has so many good texts in it. But he says that he's preparing a resolution to present to His Majesty. This is, and it's going to be the members of the House of Burgesses are going to approve this, he hopes, and send it to the king. So this is his statement to the king. And what's interesting to me is that, I mean, this has been brought up, that he wasn't talking about he does make reference to the right to leave, natural right. And, but that's the only, he doesn't talk about the other commonly referred to natural rights, just this one, or there's another one too. But then his argument, he's way out, to me, it seems like he's way out in front of everyone else that's in this debate, because he makes this, he invokes the common law He's a lawyer. He invokes the common law. He's not invoking natural rights. But in the common law, he says that, and then he finds the precedent in the Scottish, whatever it was, and he says, on the true grounds on which we declare these acts void is that the British Parliament has no right to exercise authority over us. I mean, this is really an uncompromising statement, whereas none of the other people that were debating this and forming the rights and grievances had dared to make such a pronounced, uncompromising statement. But this is directed, I don't think, to the nation or the colonies or the people. It was directed to the burgesses, and they were supposed to vote on this, and of course they didn't. And when they didn't, Jefferson retired and disappeared from public life for 8 months. So it seems like this is a very specific thing rather than a general, broad, conceptual statement that he was making. And just a response to that. Thank you.
Yeah, I think he's making an argument here that we haven't noticed, and you just brought it up. What's wrong with Parliament is that it is acting as the executive. The whole summary view is addressed by the burgesses, if they had endorsed it, to the king. And we've talked about how he's supposed to be a servant of the people. But Jefferson here is making a constitutional argument about, and that anticipates Paine's argument in Common Sense about the failure of the British Constitution, the insular Constitution for Britain. It's not really a constitution at all because the Parliament is acting in an executive role. That's the role of the king, who's supposed to be the executive. And that's why he asks for the veto power. This is an extraordinary thing on the eve of the Revolution to be asking the king to exercise such power to resuscitate a power not used in the modern British Constitution in order to preserve the balance and maintain the distinction between executive and legislative. But what's really going on that's pointing toward natural law arguments is that once the question of sovereignty is established and the responsibility of the sovereign to maintain the Constitution, and he's failing to do that, then we're on the threshold of the law of nature and nations, and the idea that without a proper sovereign, in effect, as in the Glorious Revolution, the sovereign commits a kind of suicide and destroys the Constitution, then that casts the Americans into a state of nature understood within the framework of the law of nations, because all nations stand in relation to each other as in a state of nature. That notion of that's an anarchy technically, but it's an anarchy that's much different from the kind of anarchy that Alexander Hamilton obsesses about. If you don't maintain the empire or something close to it with the capacity to rule, then all hell will break loose.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I'd add a bit to that as well. It seems to me that the summary view is, as I said earlier, is a lot closer to the theory of the Declaration and is more driven by that theory than it might appear on the surface of it. Because on the surface of it is, yes, it is a historically, to some large degree, grounded document. It's a document about the imperial constitution and not about things like a right of revolution and so on, as the Declaration of Independence is. But it seems to me that the key conceptual props for the summary view are actually the same conceptual props that the Declaration of Independence depends on. One of those being the theory that the colonists have in fact emigrated on their own, that they had a right to do this. This is a natural right for all peoples to do this, and that's what they've exercised. And that any relationship that they have to the British is one that they voluntarily undertook. Now, that's a theory very dependent on a natural rights theory. It's also very congruent with the main claims that the colonists were raising, when we generalize those claims rather than look at them as based on specific documents like this charter or that piece of legislation. That is to say that the colonists were saying, we have a right not to be taxed. We have a right, as they then expanded it, not to be legislated for without our consent. So underlying both the immigration theory, that is, we have a natural right to leave a country that we have not chosen, we have a right to come, form our own country. We have a right to form our own relations of authority with any authorities that we have. And we have a right not to be governed by people we haven't consented to. And it seems to me that that all rests on this idea that he expresses in the Declaration of Independence that the just powers of government derive from the consent of the government, of the governed, I should say. And I think that thought is, in a way, the germ of almost everything Jefferson said, both the sane things and the insane things, like his 19-year constitutional revolution, is based on that same thought. If legitimate government rests on the consent of the governed, well, then every generation is a new set of governed people, and their consent should be elicited for the government that they're under. Now, practically, that's a crazy proposal, but from the point of view of trying to be clear on the theoretical bearing of the commitments that we've made to what makes a government legitimate, it's a brilliant theme. But Madison, I think he had it right. This is a nice idea, but this isn't really going to work very well. So.
Yes, sir.
Yes, my name is Mike Klapka. I am a high school history teacher from Largo, Florida, and I want to thank you all for being here today. Number one, because I've read many of your books, and I appreciate the information. And secondly, it gave me an excuse to leave school 2 days early before Thanksgiving break. And this is very helpful. My question is not so much content-based as it is structural. Given the fact that the information that you've been sharing this morning, which is fascinating, I've been taking pages and pages of notes this morning, is probably twice as much time as I will be able to deal with any one of these documents in the class structure, knowing that, of course, that all the great educational minds are in the state legislatures of all these states, and they pick out when we're supposed to be doing things. My question is, particularly with the summary view and the declaration, but of course, any of the other documents that are pertained into this discussion, what would you think are the key points that I should be sharing with my students? And I know you've made many of them. I just want to clarify to make sure I've got that correct. But what are some of the key components if I'm going to compare one to the other? What would be those two documents? What would be the point? And if you'll give me a moment to scurry back to my seat so I can start writing some of these ideas down, I'd appreciate it greatly. Thank you.
Peter, you want to?
Well, I think the key thing to do is, one, I think Michael gave us a good introduction to this, is pseudo-Socratic drawing out the principles. And what are they? And the continuities. And I think he's exactly right about that. But I think there's also, and it depends on what class this is. There's this, what is it?
I have AP, I have dual enrollment, I have...
It's history.
Yes.
Oh, if it's history, then pull a fast one on them and read both documents and try to adduce the historical content with help from them. And therefore, they will be familiar with the first paragraphs of the Declaration. And yes, that could be a lens through which you interpret quite properly, the summary view. There is continuity, no question in my mind about that. But then if you look at the grievances in the Declaration, then you get a very powerful sense, properly understood with help from you as the pseudo-Socratic discussion leader, of reconstructing the context within which Americans made their choices. And that is, what's the news cycle, to use that term anachronistically? What's been circulating? And I would endorse a wonderful big book by Rob Parkinson that you should not assign, to your students called The Common Cause, or whatever it's called?
Common cause.
Yeah,
that's
that one, in which he shows that those claims are not just drawn from a proverbial hat, that is the grievances, that they have been, in effect, to borrow a phrase from Hamilton and Federalist One, deeply engraved on the American mind during the period of the run-up to independence. Americans are beginning to get very upset. You know, that's an alternative, and I think an important alternative pathway, that is what's on their minds, as opposed to the way Jefferson himself frames it in his famous letter late in life, in which he says, I just channeled it because the American people were thinking those thoughts in the first paragraphs. It's the combination of the thoughts in the first paragraphs that were the currency of the realm. People were talking about this sort of thing. And no originality, says Jefferson, that this is what everybody was thinking, with the circumstances in which those ideas click into place and are meaningful. If you're teaching history, that's the big takeaway.
Could I just add something here? Or somebody else? No. Just the thing that I do emphasize when I teach these two documents together is the way in which the main point of the summary view is to present us a picture of the Constitution that, in Jefferson's mind, does or should prevail between the British and the Americans. And it's not meant to be a Declaration of Independence. It's meant to be a document that can provide a basis for which the two entities can live together into the future. I find it useful to use some of the British documents that display the British understanding of the imperial constitution as a great contrast. And you get to see that, to a large degree, the American Revolution is really about the way in which the Americans and the British come to see this relationship so differently. But then I would use the Declaration to underscore some of the theoretical underpinnings of the summary view, but to bring out that it's got a very different purpose, which is to lay out a picture of what makes a government legitimate, any government, anywhere, anytime, and what, or at least as Jefferson understood that, and what that implies in our present situation, given the grievances that he lists in the document, and given the fact that the British are not, how should we say, responding to the American concerns.
Can I just add one quick thing to that?
Wait a second. We've got Annette, Doug, Kevin, and then Joanne, and then we're going to get to your questions, so be patient.
Actually, Peter pretty much said what I was going to say. Context, the timing, the differences, as Carson suggested, what happened between the two documents. And it's fascinating to look at Jefferson on his own mind, in his own mind, talking about the Constitution, as Michael said, and his presentation versus adding in with the grievances with the Declaration, and you can get this from Rob's book. Go through it and to see that these things are, everybody's sort of reporting in from the precincts saying, and they did this to us and they did that to us. So it shows the way his complaint is sort of supported by what these other people are saying as well. So.
Okay, just quickly, one of the beauties of the readings that we have are, I'd go away from those documents, I'd go to the letters. We have a lot of letters here, and this letter to Randolph, just the second paragraph, the last line, which is just, I think it's great. It speaks to the contingency, it speaks to this whole question of nation that Peter's been talking about. Jefferson says, I am sincerely one of those who would rather be in dependence on Great Britain, properly limited, so you can sort of see there's the qualifier, right, than on any other nation upon earth, or than on no nation. So in 1775, Jefferson's basically not thinking of independence as the end, right? It's the properly limited dependence on Great Britain. But I am one of those who would rather than submit to the right of legislating for us assumed by the British Parliament, so there's the sticking point about Parliament's assumption of legislative authority, and which late experience has shown they are so cruelly exercised, would lend my hand to sink the whole island in the ocean. And there's the violence. And there's that kind of Jeffersonian notion that if we don't get what we want, then the gloves are off and we bury them.
I just wanted to make a very, very quick point.
Wait a second. Don't you keep jumping ahead.
It's after Annette.
No.
Sorry.
Kevin, Joanne, and then John Bowles.
A couple of times people have made reference to the famous first two paragraphs of the Declaration of Independence. I've found that many document collections don't even include the list of grievances. So when I teach this, I tell my students in preparation for discussion in class, they should read the whole thing out loud. If you go through the list of things that the king is being accused, and of course it's not the king who's responsible, but if you go through the list of all the things the British government has already done, and I teach in a town that was actually burned down by the British Army, the tale of British abuses is very striking, and I put it that people at the time would have been more impressed with that than with Jefferson's philosophical stuff, but that could be just my taste. So besides that, when it comes to the summary view, the Virginian notion that you have a natural right to immigrate, which he borrowed from a cousin of his who had written about it in a pamphlet several years before, that I think bears consideration too. Somebody mentioned earlier, in a lot of countries today, for example, I understand if you're ethnically Japanese, you can become Japanese in a trice if your family hasn't lived there for generations. So there still are people in the world who have this old idea that you can't immigrate at all, ever. You are always ethnically of whatever ethnicity. And this is foundational in American political thought. So I would start with that and then make sure that they have attention paid to the grievances.
Joanne?
The point I wanted to make was a broader sort of teaching about this period point, and that is, I think there are there are many, but there are three main points that I think it can be hard to get across when you're teaching about the founding, with all capital letters. I think the phrase in and of itself removes contingency, suggests that there's right and wrong, and removes the fact that these are human documents. So I think if you looked at summary view and highlighted some of the very things that we were talking about, that it's inaccurate in a certain way, that there are things there that conceivably weren't true, and you in and of itself use that fact to get the students to understand that it's a document born of a particular moment and a particular need and had a particular message. I think in and of itself, getting across by highlighting things like that aren't the sort of scripture of the documents, but really are the things that show the moment that they were born in, is a great way to get over some of the humps about contingency and rightness and wrongness. And I would do the same thing just generally with Hamilton and Jefferson documents. I teach a class that's just all Hamilton and Jefferson writings, letters and reports and various things. And I think finding ways to juxtapose them so that the students can't easily say, well, that's right and that's wrong, because of course this entire period is about the fact that there was no clear path. So that would be a general way in which I would want to use these documents.
John.
I guess building on that, I would say when you talk about the Declaration, students think that it just sort of fell down from heaven or something, and I would have them read what Jefferson actually wrote, and they see what Congress added and took out. And a very good version of it is in that Peterson collection of Jefferson's writings, and get the students to read it really carefully and very aware of the text, and think about why what was added and why what was omitted, and the consequences of those omissions and additions. And I think that makes them see the Declaration in a very different way.
Did you want to ask your question?
It was answered, but just kind of, I'm a senior and I'm going to be teaching next year, teaching history, and how do you kind of address the problematic characters, especially in Hamilton and Jefferson? Do you need to qualify their writing in some way? Like, is that even necessary in teaching these characters, or are they just products of their time? Is that the best way to teach them?
Okay, we have a couple of people who are on the queue, and they may want to address your question also. Colleen and then Annette.
You can take me on.
Oh, okay.
Well, I was going to address the question before this, but let me see if I can try to put the two together. If Kevin is from a place that was burned down during the Revolution, I come from a state that houses both Philadelphia and Gettysburg, and I would emphasize the second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence and do so without any reservations, because I think, for example, that at least in Federalist 39, and one of the defenses of the Constitution is that this Constitution has to be consistent with the principles of the Revolution and with the genius of the American people. And that's found probably in that paragraph of the Declaration. I think it's helpful to ask, what are rights? I mean, even in a history class, it's incumbent upon us to take the document seriously. And that document is about this thing called rights. Where do these rights come from? Is anything a right? Is everything a right? How do we distinguish these things? And what gives authority to the government? The Declaration says consent of the governed. Why is consent of the governed necessary to the just powers of government? I think these questions seem basic, perhaps, to people who've studied these things for a while, but not necessarily to new citizens ready to, walk into the voting booth and try to figure out what are their responsibilities. Jefferson says in that letter to Henry Lee, that it's an expression of the American mind, and it comes from the great books of public right, Aristotle, Cicero, Sidney, Locke. What is public right? I mean, I think it's helpful to ask these questions. Is there an idea that informs the American mind in terms of the founding? If we find this in the Declaration of Independence, is it something that Hamilton believed in as well? I mean, he fought side by side. He actually fought in the Revolution for this idea, put his life at stake. Whatever fortune he had, but certainly a sacred honor. I think it's helpful to emphasize what they held in common in fighting side by side in the Revolution, but also to always remember these are real people who had real lives and believed in things, so much so that they dedicated their lives to these things. And I think to hold them, to actually see them as that, which I don't mean ordinary, to actually see the extraordinary in them. We live in a day and age that we don't think anybody can be a hero or anything can be extraordinary. Yet anybody who's spent time with these people knows that there's something there that's driving them that's more than ordinary. And I think it's a wonderful thing to present this, to let young people see this themselves, let them read some of the primary material because it's there. And that's a history class that they'll probably remember.
Let me thank the panelists for their contributions in this first session.